1955 to 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. served as the spiritual and political leader of the civil rights movement. During this historic time, his moral courage and conviction helped bring true democracy to the South and pride and dignity to Black America.
I come over here tonight to tell you that you are God's children, and that every man from a base black to a treble white is significant on God's keyboard. I come over here to let you know.
Though slavery was abolished in 1863, blacks in America continued to suffer the effects of racial segregation well into the middle of the 20th century. Prejudice and bigotry could be found everywhere, especially in the South.
It was a highly segregated area. I refer to it sometimes as segregation being so thick that you could cut it with a knife.
Blacks in the South couldn't go to movies with whites, couldn't eat where whites ate, couldn't use the same restrooms, couldn't drink the same water. They had separate waiting rooms at bus stations and had to sit in the back of the bus.
You would frequently be called a boy, or nigger was commonly used.
Segregation in the South went largely unchallenged until 1955, when in Montgomery, Alabama, the inspirational leadership of Martin Luther King Jr. first emerged.
I mean, he didn't want to be a leader in the beginning. He went to Montgomery instead of Atlanta because he thought Montgomery was a little quiet town where he could finish his PhD dissertation and relax and get himself together after having been through college and seminary and graduate studies. He finished his PhD, but the week after he mailed in his dissertation, Rosa Parks sat down in the front of the bus.
Now here's Rosa Parks, who's a seamstress downtown, coming back home one day, just tired. And why she didn't get up to give white men their seat, nobody knows. She just sat. And they took her to jail. So King was new and he was young and he was a hot potato. So they made him the head of the Montgomery Improvement League.
King's leadership began as he rallied support for a dramatic citywide bus boycott. 50,000 blacks in Montgomery joined together, refusing to ride the buses until their demands for desegregation were met.
We simply were saying that we were God's children and that we were full citizens of the United States and we wanted to be treated accordingly by our society. But people had not said that out loud before, and they had not acted in groups as though they were full-fledged citizens of the United States.
In Montgomery, the whites retaliated. They were angry about the continuing boycott. King's home was bombed. From his front porch, he urged his followers not to retaliate.
That was a moment in the history of the movement of the boycott when if Martin had uttered one word or had an attitude of retaliation, the whole cause could have been lost.
The buses stayed empty for 15 months as Martin Luther King's tactics led the young movement to its first victory, a court decision declaring Alabama's bus segregation laws unconstitutional.
Reporters had come to Montgomery from all over the world to see a black man doing what nobody in the world thought could ever do. Really to challenge the establishment of the South in segregation.
The courts had acted in many areas to say that segregation by race was unconstitutional, but the edicts in many areas were not being carried out. And there was a sense that you were not going to get the Congress, the President, and the full force of the law until somehow people's minds and hearts got changed.
Minds and hearts in the South were not ready to change. In city after city, civil rights groups inspired by King's tactics demanded an end to segregation. Their peaceful protests were met with violence.
Violence comes out of hatred, and hatred comes out of fear. Now, basically what happened was that we opened that question up. But Dr. King used to say that we need to open it up and expose this sickness to the sunlight so that it can heal. And so our tactics were deliberately designed to bring out in the open all of the undercurrent of violence in our society.
He said we must be ready for a season of suffering. It comes right out of his religion and the basic religious tradition that he represented goes right back to the cross.
It's really the teachings of Jesus. It's right there in the New Testament. Nothing particular new about what King was doing. Nothing particular new about what Mahatma Gandhi was doing. But it's all right here. We've preached it and we've talked about it. But it was talk and no action. And he made it walk on the ground.
In 1962, Albany, Georgia became the battleground for King's next confrontation. Hundreds of marchers were arrested, including ministers and rabbis who had come from the north.
All right, let's know what the purpose is. Come here to offer our prayers to God. What's your purpose? Our purpose is to offer our prayers to God.
Anyone else here to be heard from? Praise ye, O servants of the Lord. Praise the name of the Lord. Blessed be the name of the Lord, from this time forth and forevermore.
All right, put them in jail.
King's efforts in the South found support in Washington, where President John Kennedy watched with growing impatience.
Let me say that I find it wholly inexplicable why the City Council of Albany will not sit down with the citizens of Albany, who may be Negroes, and attempt to secure to them in a peaceful way their rights. The United States government is involved in sitting down in Geneva with the Soviet Union. I can't understand why the government of Albany, the City Council of Albany, cannot do the same for American citizens.
I think that Dr. King always felt that particularly the Kennedys and President Johnson were responsive. He felt as though he had to create a climate politically in which they could rise to the greatness that the country needed.
Kennedy felt he had to wait until events ripened, until, in a sad sense, the blacks had suffered enough to really move the minds and hearts of people.
In 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama, a shocked nation watched as a peaceful demonstration exploded into the worst violence yet experienced by civil rights protesters. 5,000 marchers were arrested, including King himself. From his cell in the Birmingham jail, King wrote,
We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. We had no alternative except to prepare for direct action, whereby we would present our bare bodies as a means of laying our case before the conscience of the local and the national community.
Spring of 1963, after the dogs and hoses were turned loose on the black protesters and Martin Luther King had sat in the Birmingham jail, Kennedy felt the country had been moved enough that he could go to Congress and call for the sweeping Civil Rights Act that he did call for.
1963, 3 months after Birmingham, with Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill before Congress, King took his case to the nation's capital. 250,000 citizens, black and white, marched in a massive show of support, and Martin Luther King spoke.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. In this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
3 months later, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. In 1964, Congress and President Lyndon Johnson joined to enact sweeping legislation which outlawed discrimination and forced the desegregation of public facilities.
This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice in our beloved country.
Later that year, Martin Luther King Jr. would become the youngest recipient of one of the world's most distinguished honors.
I accept the Nobel Prize for Peace at a moment when 22 million Negroes of the United States are engaged in a creative battle to end the long night of racial injustice.
The Nobel Peace Prize was the most significant recognition that my husband received for his work. And in a sense, I guess the fulfillment that we had at the time he received the award was so great that we felt that somehow things might get easier for us, but that was not true.
After winning the Nobel Peace Prize, King returned to the South to lead the movement in its quest for a final victory that would guarantee blacks the one basic right still denied them.
Well, I think the back of the bus issue and the lunch counter issue were issues that basically were human dignity issues. People wanted to be treated like they were full human beings. And that basically dominated the movement right up to the time of Selma. It was in 1964 in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and in 1965 in Selma that we began to raise political questions.
I don't know about you, but I'm tired of being exploited. I'm tired of being used by somebody else. And I believe that in a massive chorus we can all sing together. We are tired. We are tired of being thrown over in the worst homes. We are tired of getting the worst jobs. We are tired of having the worst schools. The way you're going to change these things will be to go all out to get the right to vote.
The grassroots campaign to register black voters in the South centered on the rural counties of Mississippi and Alabama. But finally gained national attention in Selma, Alabama. There, peaceful civil rights protesters gathered and marched and were brutally beaten by local police. Around the world, people gathered together to express their outrage and share their grief. 30,000 demonstrators poured into Selma to walk beside King on a 5-day, 54-mile march from Selma to the state capital in Montgomery, a triumphant march that was to be the culmination of the drive for voting rights in the South. In August of 1965, Lyndon Johnson signed the bill reaffirming for America's black citizens the right to vote.
I see it as one of the most creative periods in our history, not only for the black man, but for America. Because in freeing the black man, the white man was also free.
Frederick Douglass said it 100 years before, that the struggle for freedom in America is a struggle to save black men's bodies and white men's souls. Martin updated that and said black and white together. We all have problems so long as we're existing in this unequal relationship.
The decade from 1955 to 1965 accomplished extraordinary things. The face of the South was changed in terms of race. Blacks gained the right to vote. Public discrimination in public life was wiped out throughout the South. And those were the things King set out to do. Now, in his last 3 years, he just barely began dealing with another, maybe bigger, but a different question of the poverty and the condition of the northern city and the ghetto in which so many blacks throughout the country live.
We were beginning to say that this country, and he was beginning to say, that this country is really too great a nation to have 40 million people living below what everybody agrees to be the poverty line, and that we didn't need to have a society that allowed the rich to get richer and forgot about the poor.
In northern cities, discrimination in housing, education, and jobs left blacks with little more than they had in the South, and sometimes less. In the summer of 1966, rioting broke out in urban ghettos across the North. Martin Luther King brought his nonviolent movement to Chicago.
So we come bearing a message. We come bearing a message that Chicago can change. We are going to change it nonviolently. We are going singing in our hearts. Ain't going to let nobody turn me around.
Neighborhoods of Chicago and in frustrated black slums across the North, King's philosophy of nonviolence met its greatest opposition. Other black leaders, some even within his own movement, began to question the effectiveness of nonviolence.
Let's keep coming. Let's keep coming. Don't stop. You bet punk. I think I see what you made out of. You bet punk. And your mama too.
In 1967, King linked a third moral issue to those of racism and poverty, the war in Vietnam.
I speak out against this war because I'm disappointed with America. And there can be no great disappointment where there is no great love. I'm disappointed with our failure to deal positively and forthrightly with the triple evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism.
As the Vietnam War increased and his own conviction grew that we should get out of it, that it was the wrong war in the wrong place, wrong time, he had to weigh how much damage it would do to the civil rights movement.
King's stand on Vietnam cost him the support of the Johnson administration and further damaged his leadership within the civil rights movement.
Everybody was against him. Most people were against him. But if a man believes in nonviolence, he can't stop at the border.
King's work continued. In the spring of 1968, his plans for a Poor People's March on Washington were interrupted by a trip to Memphis, Tennessee, in support of striking city sanitation workers. On April 4th, 1968, at the age of 39, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated.
I would describe him as being good at what he was because of his conviction that you could change the South and you could change the world, not by war and violence, but because you believe in it, because you believe that love is better than hate, and that peace is better than war. The legacy that he leaves with us is